wonderful to be here with you today, Gena, to celebrate your book. And I have it right here. Leading Inclusion,
Yay!
Drive Change Your Employees Can See and Feel. Many congratulations. It is a how to be book rather than a how to book. I love that concept and feel. And it's a hard read, not because it's badly written. It is beautifully written, but it calls out some home truths for many of us. It's grounded in lots and lots of research, your own lived experience, and it's full of actions that you just should be taking, whether you're the CEO, the CDO, or any manager or an individual in an organization. And I think it's a groundbreaking work. So I celebrate it with you, and welcome to the show.
Well, David, after that introduction, I feel like I should maybe just take a bow or do something, But I'm really honored to be on your show, first of all, and thank you for having me. I have listened to many of your podcasts and seen the amazing guests that you have had, and so it is really an honor to be here. But as far as the book goes, I'm particularly delighted that you used the word groundbreaking, and you read a lot of books. You probably read more than I, and you talk to a lot of really smart people. So if you have been able to assess that there's value in this book for yourself or your clients, I am just delighted.
Yes, well, you are in great company, but you absolutely deserve to be. And I haven't written a book. I haven't taken that plunge yet, but that's a different story.
Yes.
But I think it's not that hard to write a book about a topic. I think it's whatever the topic is, I think it's much harder to say, what should you actually do? What should you do? And it's packed full of actions. And I think that says something about your own passion, your own cause, and your focus. So let's get stuck in. Let's talk about the catalyst for the book, the catalyst for some of the work. And let's go back to the awful killing of George Floyd that spurred clearly a lot of activity, action in the world and in the corporate world, in the business world, which is the focus of this podcast. What was it about that tragic event that led to that action?
Yeah, well, David, I do need to go back a little further because unfortunately, there wasn't necessarily anything particularly new about the George Floyd killing, except, of course, the particular inhumanity of the particular circumstances, the fact that it was on camera and all caught from beginning to end on video. And that's important to note because especially in the spring of 2020, by the time George Floyd was killed, I personally was already in a wreck because we were in the middle of a pandemic. We were all feeling as if our lives there was a lot of uncertainty. And then earlier that year, a man named Ahmaud Arbery had been killed in Georgia. And then a couple months later, Breonna Taylor had been killed. And when Breonna Taylor was killed, it hurt, on a very personal level because I kept thinking she could have been my daughter, just sort of she didn't look like my daughter, but she could have been. So by the time George Floyd was killed, actually, personally, I was in a very anxious state about what was going on in the country. However, up until that point, I had never done anything about any of these situations other than go like everyone and say, whoa, these are horrible things. We can't believe they're happening, and wish that we would find a solution. But this time I could not turn away because I started to feel like a fake and a fraud and a phony, as I have said before, in that surely there's something that Gena can do beyond just, opening her eyes and saying this is so horrible. And I decided that, like you, I had spent all of my professional career in corporate America, in corporate settings. That's what we have in common. And as a consultant, advising a variety of leaders across many different large organizations. And I had known for the entirety of that time that executives don't always hear the whole story and are often, they get such filtered information that often when they're when a crisis arises or they have to make a quick decision about, for example, social justice issues, I was pretty sure that they didn't really understand the employee experience within their own organizations that might be relevant to this conversation. And so at that point, I said, this is how I can help. I've lived this. I've consulted this. I understand these leaders and what they need, I think, for support. I think I can write a book to help them know what is the real experience of employees from traditionally disadvantaged groups in their organizations. And then once they understood that, to help them see what they could do a little bit differently that would drive really meaningful outcomes. And when I say
Yeah.
meaningful outcomes, the only meaningful outcomes are those assessed by the employees who are having the experience. And that's why, the subtitle of my book is Drive Change Employees Your Employees Can See and Feel. So those were the precipitating events.
That's brilliant framing. I mean, tragic, but brilliant framing.
Mhm.
And I love how you call out that it's actually the individuals concerned who have to say whether it's actually making a difference to success, not
Yeah.
some just vanity metrics that you can win
Mhm.
awards from. I'm being a bit facetious, but you get my
Oh,
point.
sure,
Let's
sure.
dig into that experience point, that because that's a big feature of your book and indeed your
Mhm.
works. I mean, and I quote, you talk about the experience of black workers has been hidden, misunderstood, and underestimated.
Mhm.
Um, and you talk about leaders and individuals, if you like, having spending more time noticing, more intentionality in noticing the experience. So if you have an individual who says, I need to understand that experience, what does noticing actually mean in practice?
Mhm. So, the fundamental issue, not just in the United States, but in many parts of the world, unfortunately, is that many of us live segregated lives. I don't, regardless of our races, I think most of us have experiences or lived experiences tend to be either segregated by socioeconomics, by race or ethnicity, religion, even. I mean, it's just sort of a pattern of how we live. And with regard to the issues that we're talking about specifically, because my book does focus more on race and ethnicity than other dimensions of difference,
Mm.
even though, I say very clearly what I'm hoping is that anyone who reads the book can generalize, the lessons to every other way that humans
Mm.
vary. I do think it always will require some effort because it is in the workplace then where we have a somewhat artificial situation where for most of us, that is the place where all these different groups come together in one place. And it has always been so. However, up until the spring of 2020, it seemed as if we were kind of like just ships passing in the night, oblivious to one another's unique experiences. And so the new conversation emerged after May of 2020 is a good thing. But that means that one does have to put some particular effort in order to really understand. And so you're asking me, how does one do that?
Mm.
I'll tell you another story before I give you a really clear answer to that question. When I interviewed executives last in 2021, 2020, and 2021 for the book, I interviewed about 30 senior executives, and they were very honest with me. Some of them wouldn't let me use their name, rightfully so, but they were very honest. And I asked them, what is it that holds you back from leading the actions on inclusion in your organization if you are being held back? And they said, number one, we're not even sure it belongs on our plate. Number two, we don't want to alienate clients and even colleagues who don't think that this is something we should be investing a great deal of time in. And then the third thing they said was, we're not sure we even understand what it is those who are meant to be the beneficiaries of this effort really want from us. I'm getting to your question, but they were acknowledging we don't necessarily know what it is that people want from us or how to go about it. I did another survey in that another piece of research. It was a survey approximately the same time frame. This was working women, including 149 Black women, and I asked them a similar question: what do you want from those leaders? And what they said was, oh, we know that already. We know this is what those leaders are thinking. We see the evidence of that every day in their avoidance behavior. They tend to avoid us in the literal ways of not making eye contact or not being in our physical presence. So they more back away than they approach us. So we know
It's
that.
that blatant.
Yes, it is that blatant. And so they said, we already know this is what they must have been thinking because we see it in their behavior. And then here was the cap, the thing that really tied the bow. And we interpret that as disrespect because if you respected us, you would be closer to us, and then you would better understand what our experiences and what it is that we need from you. So with regard to this whole idea of getting of really understanding, I talk about the 3 C's. You first of all have to have a certain level of curiosity. You have to believe that the people who may not look like you and who are having a different experience are worthy of enough interest that you would be curious. The curiosity will lead you to the kind of actions that could potentially create some connection. And I think of comfort as the third possibility. It's like on a scale, to get to the point of comfort, you have to pass through connection. And connection, if you are a leader, will come in a variety of ways. The first thing I do think you have to do, though, is think of this as a one-to-one problem. Don't think of it as you connecting to the masses. Think about how you would connect to an individual who has not had your experiences, who doesn't look like you. What can you do? And it's always in those little things where, first of all, you're talking to people one to one. You might be putting yourself into social situations that are unfamiliar. The other thing that you would do is, when you're going to make judgments or decisions that might affect this group of people, whatever group that is, you would be certainly talking directly to them as stakeholders in your decision making,
Hmm.
rather than making decisions and sort of telling them this is the answer. But it might mean then that we have to come out of all of our familiar places and do some things that are unfamiliar, maybe a little uncomfortable. I mentioned a story in the book where I'm sort of a tree hugger type. I'm a liberal tree hugger person who, hippie if I could get away with it, right? So that's how I am. And the guy down the street, he put up a flag that I didn't really understand, but I knew it stood for something that it stood for I believe that this particular flag had something to do with Blue Lives Matter. And I didn't really understand, but I did some research, and I figured out Blue Lives Matter said, if a police officer is killed in the line of duty, the person with a gun, especially the person who perpetrates the crime, should have a special kind of punishment. And the group is a fundraising group intended to support the families and so on that are left behind. So all of that I understood. So I finally walked up to the neighbor one day and said, "Tell me about your flag." Mind you, now I thought he might just turn around and walk away, because he knows I'm a tree hugger, because in my yard my flag said hate has no home here, and it has a heart sign and a peace sign and this. People call that, there's a name for that nowadays, that signaling virtue, they say. But no, he didn't do that. He says, "I'm a retired police officer. I know people who've been killed in the line of duty in the way I describe. My heart aches for their families. This is what I believe. I raise money. I want to help them." And he explained, and by the end of the conversation, I figured, you know what? If I were in his exact shoes, I might do this very same thing. I might. So now when we see each other in the street as he's driving by in his big truck, we wave. He waves, I wave. We might not remember each other's names, but we have broken the
Yes.
ice, and it will always be broken. Long story to say, though, that I do think each of us has to make a decision that we will cross the bridge. We will do the thing that will get us close enough to people we do not understand, so that we might be able to build those connections.
I think that's brilliant. I think we load ourselves up with assumptions, or we just avoid, as you say. So
Avoid.
there is something around that proximity, about that closeness, about the connections. And throughout what you said there, Gena, this is about humanity. This is
Yeah.
about humanity, and about a moral obligation to include people, because they're human beings. So when we
Yeah.
talk about a business case for diversity in terms of representation, I mean, that misses a trick, right?
Yeah.
That's not
Yeah.
enough.
It's actually even offensive. And it is offensive to me, because in our country, we passed civil rights legislation in the 1960s. Here we are, 2022, and we all agree that we've made very little progress. The reason, during that time, as we were making little progress, everybody was asking about the business case. And there are troves of research from the top business schools in this country, in Europe, and wherever, talking about the benefits of various kinds of diversity. And you can keep measuring that forever and ever. We already know the answer. as to whether there would be benefits in terms of financial outcomes, customer experience, profitability, and all of those things. We know the answer. So, yes, I don't have a problem with talking about the business case, or even saying that one needs to justify things that one does when you're spending a lot of money, especially in a publicly held company. However, since we already know the answer to that question, I believe that leaders have been using this as a sort of a place to hide, because as long as you bring up the
Yeah.
business case, you don't get around to the core issue. This is a human issue. So it's not that when I told you the story about the executives and the women, that's a human emotional issue. The women can see the distance, and the leaders know that they're distancing themselves. So
Yeah.
it's not a financial issue, it's not an operational issue. But the other thing about that I would say too is that I think if you were thinking about this more on a one-on-one basis, you wouldn't use that language, because if you were talking to Gena specifically about Gena's challenges, I don't think there's any person of any type in the world that would just turn away and say, well, now that I understand that, I'm not going to do anything. It's
Yes.
easy to do nothing when you have the distance.
Yes. I mean, throughout what you've been saying, and in the book, you refer to conscious or unconscious biases. And
Mhm.
I would like to get even more specific now, because I want this podcast, this conversation, to be all about action, as well as the understanding that gets you
Okay.
to action.
Mhm.
But where, if you look at the workplace, where do the biggest biases show up day to
Mm.
day?
Yeah. So biases show up if we're talking. They start very much at the beginning of an employee life cycle, if you would. Coming into the organization. I have spent a lot of my time in financial services, and I'm going to pick on financial services for a minute as an example. It's a perfect example of a business where we always said you had to have the degree from this particular school, and then you do this particular thing, and then you enter in this particular way. You're trained in a certain
Right.
sequence of events, and then you get to their big customer facing jobs. And within that idea, which is still very powerful and so dominant still, it's very difficult for someone who didn't go to the right school or didn't start in the associate job to ever consider that they would get to the partner role. Same thing in consulting. So there's that sort of thing, and that comes from the bias that comes from sort of stereotyping and just getting familiar, having a familiar pattern and sticking to that familiar pattern. But then when you think about, let's say, organizations where I always say follow the money, wherever the pockets are in an organization, where either the revenue is generated or the products are created and innovated. So let's say
Yes.
engineering and sales, regardless
That's where
of
the
what you
power
call
is.
it,
Yeah.
that's where the power is. And if you
Mm.
look in those functions as a general rule, I'm generalizing here, what you see is that the characteristics of the people tend to be pretty homogenous, whether in
Mm.
terms of gender,
Mm.
whether in terms of ethnicity,
Mm. Mm.
education, and so on. Um, but it just boils down to the fact that humans really prefer to be with other people who are similar to themselves, to ourselves. So this is a human problem.
Mm.
But with regard to this bias, I do think another aspect of it is that if you've never been exposed to people who are different than you, it's hard for people sometimes to even notice the capabilities of the people around them who could be part of this problem,
Yes.
solving the problem, delivering the results.
Mm.
Um, I once worked with an attorney who was in another building in the company in which I worked. We were working on something quite important, and he decided that he would come visit me in my office rather than finishing the thing up by telephone. This was pre-Zoom, and so he came. I saw someone walking past my door in my office, and eventually, back and forth. Eventually, he tucked his head in and he said, "Do you know where I'd find Dr. Cox?" I said, "You're looking at her." His brain could not process that the person who has been working with him with this level of sophistication on this project for all this time could be one and the same as that person he's physically seeing in the space that he was pointed to. So, I know that what I'm basically saying, I believe I am repeating myself to some degree, which is that a lot of this really comes down to a self-awareness and understanding of a need for you to be conscious and purposeful in thinking about your decision making about critical, talent decisions, decisions that put people in the limelight or give them the kind of power and influence that, where you've never seen a person like that in that situation before. But the bottom line is, senior leaders, organizations have got to establish a vision. You have to be able to say why this matters if you're going to make changes about these kinds of things in
Yes.
organizations.
There's
Because
got to be a
if
stronger belief, right? It's more than just a
right,
series of tactical changes. It has to be a belief system of being,
right,
this is the type of organization we want to be and should be.
yes, and
And I
this is the
guess,
kind of leader I want to be.
yeah, I mean, you talk about self-awareness there, and that's obviously fundamental. For some people, that would be a big leap in being self-aware. They
Yeah.
may have sleepwalked through their corporate life. And I guess there could be a role for individuals around them who
Hmm.
call them out in terms of either the actions they take, the words they use. Is there a role for people to be direct and
Oh,
interventionist to say, come on,
yeah,
does
there
that work?
certainly is, but that is a role that would only ever be played in an environment of safety, where one believes that the entire organization is heading in the right direction. And when you see something that varies from this desired goal, you feel like you have permission and you have the psychological safety to say, "Oh, you probably didn't notice it, but when you said this or when you did this, this is the effect that it had or that I observed or whatever." And offer your suggestion. There are a whole many actions that have to precede that in building a culture where what you're describing would happen.
Yes.
The truth is that everything we were talking about before was a little bit on the personal side, the interpersonal aspects of this challenge. And so I do think individuals at all levels need to think about how do they want to show up in the world, especially with their coworkers, and make a decision about that. But certainly for the entity, for the whole organization, there has to be a vision for what are we doing, why are we doing this. And maybe this is where you can use words like business case, because I think of it as organizations that do not understand the value of diversity and inclusion are likely suffering from a diversity and inclusion deficit, like any other kind of deficit, because there are organizations that have not only understood this for decades. Let's take an IBM, an organization where I previously worked and where I can say for sure that there's so many things that they have had in place for so long. That's not to say they're perfect either, but there are organizations that have had understood this for a long time, and then there are organizations that are starting from zero, or maybe from below zero, which
Mm.
surely puts you at a disadvantage in an economy and in a social situation where especially younger employees are saying, well, what's so hard about this? What's so difficult about fairness and
Yeah, it's
equity?
obvious.
This
There's a
is
default. It's a default.
this
I
is
mean, what you're
table
saying there is,
stakes.
yeah, what you're saying is
Yes,
effectively this has to be central, embedded, as we used in our
yes,
article together, infused, not
yes,
what is often perceived as an HR issue or an HR problem to solve.
yes,
And
yeah.
I mean, on that front, given that you've nudged me into the organisational from the individual, I like that. Keep going. Um, is the CDOs, the Chief Diversity Officers? Many organisations have appointed them. In a nutshell, in a nutshell, what's your view on their role and impact?
Yeah. So, a chief diversity officer, a chief inclusion and diversity officer, whatever you want to call it, can have significant positive impact in an organization, but only if he or she has direct access to the CEO and to the C-suite in such a way that their actions are driven by a vision and a strategy and are not ad hoc and random and without sort of any definition of what success would look like. And the
Mm.
funny thing about what I just said is that it isn't profound, because this is the way we deal with every other business problem, right?
Mm.
I wrote an article in LinkedIn, I think, a couple of years ago, but why aren't we using the same skills that we use for every other strategic challenge? I still don't
That's a great
understand
point.
that. So often, what happens, as you can see from all of the data in the Wall Street Journal and Bloomberg and so on, these folks are hired into these roles. Many are hired into the roles, and they are reporting to someone other than the CEO. In fact, many are reporting to the Chief Human Resources Officer. Now, I have
Yes.
nothing against Chief Human Resources Officers, But even CHROs themselves would tell you that very often they operate on very thin ice when it comes to their own influence and political clout in the C suite. So if you take a position like this and it reports to the CHRO who does not have power and clout across the
Mm.
enterprise, you're already setting them up for for not being able to accomplish much. But beyond that, CDOs themselves will say that we are excluded. We don't get the resources we need to fund the activities that might be meaningful. In other words, we're sidelined. And it is these issues tend to be handled as if only people who have certain physical characteristics, the ones from the protected group or the disadvantaged,
Yes.
are the ones that lead this work. It's over to the side. It's almost as if to say, I don't really want to see this over here. Let's just push it over to the side. Let's
Yeah.
let them
Let's get
handle
back
it.
to business, as it were. Let's get back to
Yeah,
business.
let them handle it. But it doesn't work. And the other thing about that is, as organizations do this over and over, the very employees who are waiting to see the change are still waiting. They're still saying, I don't see anything. And furthermore, they're saying, oh, really? We have a chief diversity officer? Let's see. Oh, so this person comes in. Oh, we see they have no power. They have no clout. It just adds another red mark. It's not a
And it's a very
positive
visible
in
one. It
any
could
way.
actually make it worse in some ways because it's very
Of course
visible.
it does.
But let me just chip in here, which with you in one part of the book you talk about the fact that people of color, they don't need special leadership or
No.
more leadership. I was really struck by that
Yeah.
sentence, and you said that what they need is leaders to provide them with the same support as
Right.
others.
Right.
And
Which is why
why are they not receiving it? Is
which,
that's that you're
yes.
different to us, to the prevailing groups and norms. I was really struck with that statement. It hit me hard, I have to say.
Good, because it is another one of these illogical things, irrational things that I keep seeing over and over. I was presenting the reason I can articulate that so clearly, although I've known it forever, is I presented a webinar last year. At the end of it, a wonderful young man, raised his hand on Zoom and said, "I want to ask you a question." He says, "I have some Black women on my team, and I don't know how to manage them." I said, "What do you mean by that?" He said, I don't know what to do. I said, "Someone has sold you a bill of goods. Someone has taught you that in order for you to manage and lead people who don't look like you, that you have to do something different for those people. Here's an alternative. Do the very same thing that you do for all of your other employees, and try not to intentionally make them so separate, so different, because guess what? It's the same leadership skills. Now, those individuals, then if you got to know them, might say to you they have some unique preferences, needs, whatever they might ask for, just like another employee. And you might notice that there could be a pattern to that if, for example, they have not previously had access to things that others have. But fundamentally, it would be the same skills. You, as a leader, must approach, you must connect to understand, and then your job is to support each of these people and help them to thrive as you do the rest. So, diversity and inclusion is nonsense if it's thought of as a separate thing or a side thing. It's just a subset of effective leadership, because if you are not effective at leading 100% of the people in your team, in your organization, you are not an effective leader.
That for me is the central tenet of your book. It's
Yeah.
so striking, and it's the mindset of actually do what you do. Be curious, make the connections, get that bring the proximity in, but you're going to learn new things from a group of people and a group of individuals you probably
Mhm.
haven't engaged with before, so get ready but actually it's the same process, as opposed to it
Yes.
being, oh, I now need special dispensation or a special toolkit or special whatever it is. I think that's, wow, I mean, that really moves me, and I look back at some of my own career and think, gosh, I didn't do some of that as inclusive as I
But that's
tried to
my
be
whole
throughout my
that's my
tenure.
whole point, David. There's such an opportunity in our business schools in particular, because we're very comfortable graduating people who study marketing and finance in particular, and sales and supply chain and those functions, those operational functions in the business. And then we have a tendency to take all this other human stuff. First of all, we call it soft skills, which I absolutely hate that label.
Mm,
Because
mm,
apparently it's meant to say it's subordinate to hard skills, which has to do with finance and operations and so on.
mm.
So we, first of all, we make that fundamental, that split in the way we think about this obligations of these leaders. So people graduate from these programs thinking, oh, I'm well prepared. But if we haven't been attending to the human element, and then within the human element, helping people to understand, as I say, that humans vary, human variation is normal. If you're going to lead a group of people and they vary, you've got to learn to lead the variation. It's not even it's such a simple idea, but
Yes.
I know it's not
But
being
it's not
taught
been
that
framed, if
way.
I may interject, it's not been framed in with such clarity before, at least to me.
Okay.
And I think that will be the strength of it. Because in
Well, thank
some
you.
ways, not only are you calling out a simpler path, and that's a strength, by the way, but also you're dismantling any excuses people should have, being blunt.
Yeah, well, and it's very well, once I had my own epiphany about how I might communicate this, it also is very purposeful, because those who would argue against this, what would be the argument against this idea? Because you said you are the manager, you said you're the leader, you said you're in charge, and you feel it's okay to only be in charge of 75% or to only lead 70. I mean, no, you would never think that. And those who evaluate your performance ought not think that either. So whether you call it a moral obligation or just a common sense, requirement for leadership, I do think you get to the same conclusion, because my goal, related to the question you asked, is that one day we would never need a chief diversity officer. We would
Yes.
never need a CIDO, because some people would have figured out that they will be more likely to transcend these variations when they just subsume them under what I call effective leadership, and just start from that point.
Yes. That should be a goal. What else in terms? Let's talk about Gina a little bit more. What else? How else would you describe the impact that you want to have? This about your work, this book being an important part, but not the only part of your work. What
Mhm.
impact do you want to have on the world around you?
Yeah, thank you for asking me, David. So, we talked about what pushed me to write the book, and you can see that, for my daughter's sake, for the sake of people who are not yet born, all of our next generations, I would like for them to have a better time as they work together in corporate life and then beyond, for everybody. Because all of the things that we have been describing today are manifested in social awkwardness when we are together
Yes.
it is very awkward. It is bizarre how awkward it can sometimes be. I mean, I won't tell you any stories or enough in the book, but frankly, Gina, am really probably not even I'm somebody who has been lucky in this regard. First of all, I am well educated. I have and I'm trained in a particular discipline where it just comes naturally to me to sort of be hovering, 10 feet ahead and above and looking down and sort of observing things and putting them together. I do that very easily. So what about the people who are just sort of stumbling through life? They graduate from high school or college, they go off and they think, I'm just going to do a job, and then they discover this reality. They don't know what to do with it on any side of it, right? It is an additional burden that we place in our society on our young people, who then figure out the rules early on, conform to them, and it makes them shrink. It makes
Yes.
them shrink if they are consistently disadvantaged, but it also makes them shrink even if they are in the group that has more power and influence, because your view of the world is very limited. You're missing, so you have no idea that you're missing so much, but you are, because we tend to be very provincial in the way we look at our lives and the people in it. So I suppose, I spend most of my life growing up on a small island, and when you live on an island, you look outward. You import everything you need, and you travel
Mm,
because that's what you
mm,
need to. There has to be that. I think that helps me to see that there's another way, a way where foreigners come in and become whatever, and you go out, and there's all that movement, because that actually is what's happening in our world. But in our small worlds, in our teams and so on, we should look at that and say, how come we're selling, the one product that I always think about, maybe that's a little unfair, but forever, ever, band-aids have been pink. I shouldn't have used the brand. Let me repeat that. Forever, bandages have been pink. I don't and no one ever thought about that, because we just
Mm.
went and bought our bandages, and then one day you go, why is the bandage this color? And then beyond that, it's labeled as skin tone. Why? How did that happen? So that's an obvious example, but I use that example to say there are so many things like that in everything we do, that
Yes.
if you're making a product, whatever that is, or a service, it would be good to understand the needs of the
Of the
various
full
various
customer base,
people.
bluntly, your
Yes,
full customer base of full
yes,
people.
yes,
So last question then, Gena.
yeah.
When you're doing your best, most brilliant work, what habits and practices do you
Yeah.
employ?
So I'm a raging introvert. And most people don't know that about me, because you see me doing things like this, which are required to do my job. Like, this is how I was trained as a consultant, so I know how to do it. But left to my own devices, and also what I need in order to generate my best ideas, is a little bit of quiet and peace. And so I do my best work at the beginning of the day, when there are no other noises, there are no other people. And I just like to let things, I don't know, seep in, and sort of
Mm.
settle in a little bit. I'm not a quick thinker. I mean, I can be, but I do my best work when I have the opportunity to just let things, just go for a bit. And then one day I go, there we go. I think I see step one and maybe step two.
Love it.
So that's the way that I think, and that's what I need. So I am definitely a paper and pen person. And my
Mm.
publisher, when I finished the book, my publisher has given me a notebook of exquisite quality. I am so excited. I cannot wait to
Lovely.
write on this notepad. And I have a brand new pen that another person has gifted. I cannot wait. So yeah, I'm getting a little carried away with that. But the truth is, I said that because I like to write things down and see how they connect to one another, and I cannot do that on a computer. My brain doesn't work.
Yeah. I think some of the best ideas they do take time. I think we're often feel under pressure, either ourselves putting pressure on, ourselves putting pressure on ourselves, or
Yeah,
others looking to others and thinking, I've got to just push something out. I've got to
right.
produce. Whereas you can, and there is something about being visible.
Yeah,
But some of our best work comes from when you have to scratch your head. I call it put a cold towel around your head, as it were,
yeah, yeah.
and then look down at the page, go for a walk, go for a wander, and it
Yes.
comes back to you. So I applaud you. I applaud you for that.
Hmm.
Gena, this has been a conversation I've been looking forward to for a long time. This is an important topic, a topic that has been, in some quarters, I would argue, ill-served by some of the books and articles and work. And yours is now a book that is, I think, will dispel some of the myths and give people a clear manifesto and indeed a manual to just treat humans as who, wherever they are, for all their strengths and brilliance and differences,
Yeah.
breaking down some of the barriers that I think we put in our heads, and then also some of the systems that we have, some of the biases that we have in our workplaces. So I
Mm-hmm.
applaud you for your work. I applaud you for who you are. Um, at a practical level now, where can people find out more about you and your work?
Yeah, absolutely. You can go to my website, which is, my name is Gena with an E. I don't know why, but it's GenaCox.com. You can go there and learn about my work. What I'll do is I'll leave you with a link so that your listeners can maybe go and grab a few resources that I'd like for them to be able to have access to. And that will be at leadinginclusion.com.
Wonderful. Gena, that was a moving, stimulating, and enriching conversation. I'm very grateful to you. And that was another edition of Lancefield on the Line. I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did. Please check out the other episodes in the series. Sign up to the YouTube channel and to the podcast and give us a nice rating if you're feeling generous. And Gena, thank you ever so much again.
It has been a pleasure.
Thank you.